4. An unmarked opening in the tall pines signaled the dirt entrance to Spite Lane. Sivan pulled onto the shoulder of Blue Angel Parkway and put his car in park. "I can't believe you took a babysitting job here, Mabel," he said to his baby sister. "What were you thinking?" "I was thinking it was the mature thing to do," she said, using his words against him. He just sighed. Mabel leaned forward and peered out the car window through the dark canopy to try to see what lay beyond, but it was no use. The forest here had been allowed to grow unkempt for years, and the gate had been set too far back to see from the parkway. Mabel opened the passenger door and hopped out. "Wait for me at Badass Coffee after you're done," Sivan instructed. "I'll swing by as soon as my shift is over." Mabel nodded in agreement and closed the door. Then she turned to face the unmarked property and took a deep breath. She wasn't scared. It was just a stupid babysitting job. It was no big deal. Whatever. Behind her, Sivan drove away. It was then that Mabel realized the woman she was going to be working for mentioned a gate, but not how to unlock it. Mabel pulled her phone out of her back pocket, intending to text the woman for the code. But as she approached the wood and iron structure, she realized there was no need. The gate was open and in obvious disrepair. It likely hadn't closed in years. Studying it, Mabel wondered if it had ever worked properly. The proportions of the thing made no sense. It was taller on one side than the other, and broken lampposts jutted out awkwardly, as though they had sunk unevenly into the ground. Mabel thought it was odd, given so much of the lore of the place was based on how sturdy everything had been built. Beyond the gate, the dark tunnel of pines opened into a sprawling field, littered with storybook houses built on sharply crested mounds. It was nothing like what Mabel had expected. Spite Lane wasn't exactly a lane. It was more like a winding path on a Candyland board. The street curved back and forth so that the houses faced all angles, some with the rear facing another's front door. None of the homes had a proper yard. Few had a fence, and the fences that existed were all broken. Accentuating the odd layout of the neighborhood were the houses themselves. Mabel had heard them called Victorian, but this term must have been used loosely, as the homes were all so unique. They each shared the tall, curved gables, the narrow turrets, and the deep, wraparound porches of the Spitzer mansions. But otherwise, the homes shared few architectural details. One had ornately carved wooden window frames. Another had gargoyles monitoring the roof. Mabel walked past a house with such large, tattered cloth awnings. The whole thing looked like a pile of rags about to blow away in the breeze. The houses were also painted a rainbow's worth of colors. There was an electric blue house with lime green trim, and a house that was all purple, including the roof shingles, and one house that was orange as a pumpkin with windows for eyes, a door for a nose, and broken porch rails that formed a mouth. Double-checking, Mabel glanced at her phone for the Thomas's house number. As she recalled, it was 123 Spite Lane, but this information was useless, as the numbers of the homes made no sense. The first one she'd passed was numbered 520. The second was 1633. Two of the houses didn't have numbers visible at all. It went without saying that the house farthest from the gate and the largest and the highest sitting was surely the Spitzer house itself, so that wasn't it. Mabel stopped in the middle of the quiet lane and began to type a message to her new employer, asking which house was hers, when the dots began to bounce. "It's the red house with the yellow front door," read the text from Miss Thomas. Mabel looked up. Did the woman know Mabel was standing right here in the street? The red house was 2 houses over, down, across from... The locations made no sense. Away. Mabel walked right up to it with the distinct feeling Miss Thomas was watching out the window. But when she knocked on the dingy wooden door, nothing happened. Mabel had to knock again before the woman finally appeared, looking frazzled and out of sorts, not like she'd just sent a text. She was wearing a vintage-style apron over a brown floral print dress. Her shoes were black and clunky, and her mousy brown hair was pulled up on top of her head in a messy bun. "Come in," she said, shooing Mabel inside like she was in a hurry, as she wiped her hands on the apron and walked through the living area to the kitchen. As Mabel followed her across the room, she looked over to see a young, tow-headed girl sitting on an overstuffed couch, watching television. She had an empty ceramic plate on her lap and a half-empty glass of milk in one hand. "I'll have more cookies right out," cried Miss Thomas. The girl did not look away from the TV. In the kitchen, the girl's mother donned a couple of oven mitts and pulled a tray of cookies out of the oven, placing them on the stovetop. Without waiting for them to cool, she yanked off the mitts, tossed them towards the sink, and began stacking the cookies on a plate. Without having a chance to cool, the cookies were too gooey to hold their shape. Miss Thomas cursed as she stacked the crumbling sweets, wiping them off the spatula with a thumb, and then licking said thumb when it burned. Then she practically ran the cookies out to her daughter. Mabel had to step out of the way to keep from being barreled into by the woman, and in the living room she heard her say, "Here you go. Sorry that took so long. Fresh out of the oven." "They're broken," came the unexpectedly serious voice of the small child. "I'm so sorry, Twyla," said Miss Thomas. "I have to go, but I'll ask Mabel." "It's fine. Just go," the child said quietly. Mabel was shocked at her impolite tone. If Mabel had ever talked to her mother that way, she would have felt the responding slap on her cheek for a week after. More shocking was watching the woman re-enter the kitchen with fear-struck eyes. She had retrieved the other plate from the child and placed it on the counter. Then she sighed and seemed to calm a little. Great, Mabel thought. This kid is a real spoiled brat. That explained the high pay. Then she reminded herself that this gig was temporary. Take the money and run. 2 weeks and almost $500. Make it work. "So, Mabel, right?" Miss Thomas gathered herself, adjusting her messy bun and removing the apron. She threw it over a kitchen chair. "Thanks for coming. It's been really difficult to find someone because—" She stopped herself momentarily. "We just moved here recently. Anyway, thanks for being available on such short notice." "No problem, Miss Thomas," Mabel said. "You can call me Christy," said the woman. No mother had ever suggested Mabel use their first name. It was kind of cool. It made Mabel feel grown up. Mabel tried to guess Christy's age. She seemed pretty young to be a mom. She didn't look much older than Sivan. Mabel figured that's just how young moms were. They were cooler than the old moms who acted like they were so much better than Mabel, like they knew so much more. "I won't be here when you arrive tomorrow. You'll meet Twyla at the gate, where her bus drops her off after school at 3:30. Then you'll walk her home and hang out with her here till I get home from work at 5:30. I took the afternoon off today so I could show you around, but from here on out, I won't be here, so—" Christy walked past Mabel again, went to the front door, and opened it. She pointed at something on the porch. Mabel followed to see. There was a small metal box sitting on a table next to a broken porch swing. "There's a key in that box to open the front door. You can use that when you get here." Mabel thought it was very strange that they would keep a house key in such an obvious spot, but she just nodded. "Okay, Christy," she said uncomfortably. They headed back inside and stood in the entry looking over at Twyla. She can just watch television until I get home, said Christy. Make her a snack, whatever she wants. Play games, draw. There are coloring books in the kitchen. Without taking her eyes from the screen, Twyla put a finger over her lips and said, "Shh." Christy bit her lip, then whispered, "Just don't go upstairs." Mabel was caught off guard. "What?" Christy turned and gave Mabel a gravely serious look. "Whatever you do, just stay downstairs. Don't go up there. Don't let Twy go up there. Stay down here until I get home. Do you understand?" Mabel's curiosity was piqued beyond imagination. What on earth was upstairs? "Mabel, promise?" Christy pressed. She put a hand on Mabel's shoulder. The weight of it was leaden. Christy squeezed. "Promise me." Yes, of course," Mabel said. "We'll just hang out down here." Christy's fingernails dug under Mabel's collarbone. "Thank you." Just as Mabel was about to cry out from the pain of Christy's grip, Christy let go. Mabel remembered Fernanda's warning about a serial killer. Could Christy be a serial killer? Mabel imagined Christy's eyes were what other people sometimes referred to as crazy eyes. Was that enough of a sign to know for sure? Christy gave one last look at the 6-year-old, then yanked a purse from the hook next to the front door and slung it over her shoulder. "Great, okay. I'm going to the store. I'll be back by 5:30, like we discussed." "Okay," Mabel said, the word barely out of her mouth as the swollen yellow door slammed shut. Mabel heard a car engine rumble as Christy slowly drove away. When she glanced back at the living room, little Twyla sat on the couch staring her down. That's not creepy at all, Mabel thought. In the background, the television droned on. A commercial Mabel had never seen advertised, "A cool, new toy." It had been a minute since Mabel had played with toys. This one didn't look like something she would have ever owned or been interested in. It was an animatronic train with a face. Round eyes and round cheeks bulged over fat lips that opened to say catchphrases like, "Let's play a game," and "Are you up for an adventure?" By pushing the smokestack, 2 robotic arms popped out from the sides with cartoonish, white-gloved hands. It cried out one of its pre-recorded messages, and its wheels began to turn. Mabel watched the child in the ad unbox the train, awkwardly hug it, and then follow it around their house as it rolled ahead, eyes darting back and forth, mouth opening and closing, hands jiggling on spindly arms, yelling out questions and commands. "Follow your demonic leader," she thought, and gave a little laugh. "What's so funny?" Twyla asked in monotone. "Nothing," Mabel said. She took a step towards the kitchen. "Hey, you want a color?" "Your mom said there..." "She's not my mom," Twyla said. Mabel was caught off guard, but tried not to show it. What was that supposed to mean? "Oh, well, that's okay," she replied. "Anyway, she said there were coloring books in the kitchen." Mabel passed by the child on her way to the kitchen and dining areas where she tried to guess which cabinet would hold the supplies. In the background, she heard Twyla switch the television off and assumed the girl would join her momentarily. Mabel rifled through a couple of cabinets by the kitchen door, shuffled the papers on the counter, and wandered to and fro, but she didn't find the books. "Hey, Twyla, do you know where your mom... Christy keeps the coloring books?" There was no reply. Mabel cocked an ear. The house was totally silent, She walked out to the living room. The TV was off, and the girl was nowhere in sight. "Twyla?" "Yes?" Mabel spun. Twyla wasn't next to or behind her. "Up here," said the girl. Mabel looked up and saw Twyla at the top of the stairs. Oh, no. "Twyla? You're not supposed to be... Can you come back down here, please? I don't think you should be up there." The young girl stood for a moment and observed Mabel as though she were legitimately considering her plea. She was perfectly still. Her stringy hair hung as limp as her arms by her sides. Mabel could now see the shape of her dress. It hung loose over her skinny frame. All those cookies, and the girl looked like she hadn't eaten in weeks. She was so pale. She almost disappeared into the shadows of the upstairs hall, like a ghostly apparition of a child, not a real girl. The girl opened her mouth to speak. "Why don't you come up here?" And before Mabel could argue, the girl disappeared into one of the rooms.